Nobody in that building knew who he really was. Not yet. Today, that was about to change forever. He built this place with his bare hands. But the woman who stole it from him had a plan tanned. And today was the day she'd spring it.
They thought he was just a driver, just a single dad trying to survive. They were about to find out exactly who he was.
She laughed as they walked him out in cuffs. She should have been watching his hand, Leo, because he was already making the call that would end her empire.
The handcuffs clicked shut before Daniel Carter even understood what was happening. If you have ever been judged for how little you have, instead of who you truly are, stay with this story until the end, because what happens next will remind you why the truth always finds its way to the surface. And if a story about quiet strength, hidden truth, and a father's love for his daughter means something to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is only the beginning. Daniel had walked into Sterling Tower that Tuesday morning the same way he had for the last 4 years, a Euro badge in hand, coffee in the other, his daughter's small purple backpack slung over his shoulder because he'd promised to drop it off at her school on his lunch break. He was 35 years old, with tired brown eyes that had seen more heartbreak than most men twice his age, a light stubble he never quite found time to shave clean, and a plain white button-up shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone slightly soft and gray at the collar. To everyone in that building, he was simply Dan from Logistics Euro, quiet, punctual, always polite, always the first to help a coworker carry a box or fix a jammed printer. Nobody asked him much about his past. Nobody thought to. What none of them knew, what not a single person walking past him in that marble lobby that morning could have possibly guessed, was that 7 years earlier, Daniel Carter had built the very foundation this company stood on. He'd started Sterling Innovations from a garage with 2 laptops in a dream, back when it wasn't even called Sterling, back when his wife, Emily, was still alive, and they used to stay up until 3 a.m., writing code and sketching business plans on the backs of grocery receipts, laughing about how one day they'd have an office with a view of the whole city. They got that office. They got that view. And then, 18 months after the company took off, Emily was gone, a sudden illness that no amount of money or success could have stopped, and Daniel was left holding a newborn daughter and a company that suddenly felt like it belonged to a life he no longer recognized. He didn't disappear because he was broken, though he was. He disappeared because his daughter, Lily, needed a father who tucked her in at night, not a CEO who missed every school play chasing quarterly earnings. So Daniel did something almost no one in his position would have done. He quietly transferred day-to-day control to his sharp, ambitious business partner, a woman named Victoria Sterling, kept a majority ownership stake hidden behind a private holding trust with a name nobody could trace back to him, and stepped into the background of his own creation. He took a modest logistics coordinator job under a slightly different professional name, just to stay close enough to watch over what he and Emily had built, without ever having to explain himself to anyone. For 4 years, he raised Lily alone. He packed her lunches with little handwritten notes tucked inside the napkin. He learned to braid her hair badly, and then he worked his quiet job, collected his modest paycheck, and let the world believe exactly what it wanted to believe about him, that he was just a single dad getting by. Victoria Sterling, on the other hand, had never gotten by on anything modest in her life. She was 45, sharp-featured, always dressed like she was one meeting away from gracing a magazine cover, with a sleek black bob that never moved out of place and a smile that could charm a room or cut it in half, depending on what she needed that day. She had taken the reins of the company Daniel built, and over the years, had begun to believe, genuinely believe, that it had always been hers. She rewrote the company's origin story in press interviews, made herself the face of every innovation Daniel had originally dreamed up, and slowly, deliberately, began finding ways to push out anyone who remembered the truth of how Sterling Innovations really began. She didn't know that Dan from Logistics was one of the last living witnesses to that truth. She didn't know he still legally owned 51% of the very company she paraded around as her own. What she did know was that quarterly numbers were slipping, that a federal audit was quietly circling some irregular transfers she'd made from a supplier contract fund into a shell account tied to her sister's real estate business, and that she needed someone to blame before anyone noticed the money trail led back to her. She needed a scapegoat, and when her assistant mentioned, almost in passing, that a logistics coordinator named Daniel Carter had flagged unusual invoice numbers 3 weeks earlier and quietly forwarded them to compliance, Victoria saw her opening. It didn't matter that Daniel had done exactly what an honest employee should do. It mattered that his name was already in the system, attached to the very transactions she needed someone else to be guilty of. She moved fast. Within days, doctored records appeared in the system showing Daniel's login credentials tied to the fraudulent transfers. A concerned anonymous tip landed in HR's inbox. Security footage was quietly edited to show him lingering near a server room he had no real reason to be near, footage Victoria made sure was accidentally shared with the police liaison the company kept on retainer for corporate security matters. By the time Tuesday morning came, everything was in place. All she had to do was let it play out in front of enough people that no one would ever ask a second question. Daniel had no idea any of this was coming. He'd spent his weekend the way he spent most of them at Lily's soccer game, cheering louder than any other parent on the sideline even though her team lost 4-0, then making pancakes shaped like uneven stars because that was the only shape he could manage, laughing with her at his own lack of artistic talent. Lily was 8 years old now, with 2 brown pigtails that never sat quite even, and a gap-toothed smile that reminded him painfully, beautifully, of her mother. She'd asked him that morning, as he dropped her at school, whether he thought he'd ever get promoted at his job. He'd smiled and told her that some things mattered more than promotions. She hadn't understood what he meant. He hoped she never would have to. He walked into the lobby at 8:47 a.m., badge beeping him, through the turnstile the same way it had 1,000 times before. He nodded to Marcus at the front desk. He held the elevator for a woman from accounting he vaguely recognized. Everything felt ordinary, right up until the moment it didn't to Euro, right up until he stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor and saw 2 uniformed police officers standing near his desk, along with the head of HR, and a few feet back, arms crossed, wearing a smile she wasn't even trying to hide, Victoria Sterling. "Daniel Carter?" one of the officers asked, though it wasn't really a question. "We need you to come with us. There are some serious allegations regarding financial fraud tied to your employee credentials." "Oh." The floor went quiet. Coworkers who had shared lunch breaks with him, who had asked him for printer help just last week, froze at their desks, watching. Daniel felt his stomach drop, not from guilt, but from the sheer, dizzying unfairness of it, the specific kind of helplessness that comes from being blamed for something you know with absolute certainty you did not do. He opened his mouth to explain, to ask what was happening, and one of the officers gently but firmly turned him around, guiding his hands behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a cold mechanical finality that seemed far too loud in the silent office. He looked up, past the officer's shoulder, and found Victoria's eyes. She was standing near the boardroom glass, arms still folded, and she was laughing not loudly, not for anyone else to hear, just a small, satisfied, private laugh. The kind of laugh a person allows themselves when they believe they have finally, completely won. She had spent years watching this quiet, unremarkable logistics man with a strange, low-grade unease she could never quite explain, and now, watching him being led away in handcuffs in front of the entire 4th floor, that unease finally dissolved into pure, easy satisfaction. What Victoria didn't know what she had never once bothered to find out in 4 years of walking past him in the hallway was that Daniel Carter still held the original founding documents of Sterling Innovations in a fireproof safe in his apartment. She didn't know that buried in state corporate filings under a holding company called Emily Grace Trust, named after his late wife, sat 51% ownership of everything she called hers. She didn't know that Daniel had a lawyer, an old college friend named Marcus Webb, who had handled the original incorporation and had checked in with him quietly every single year, just in case Daniel ever needed to step back in. And she certainly didn't know that as the officers walked him past the boardroom glass, Daniel's cuffed hands instinctively brushed against the phone in his pocket. And in that single moment of humiliation, something inside him, something that had been dormant for 4 long years, quietly woke back up. They processed him at the downtown precinct like any other suspect, and Daniel sat in a small gray interview room for what felt like hours, calm on the outside, his mind working in fast, precise circles on the inside. He knew exactly what those transaction numbers were because he was the one who had flagged them. He knew exactly why they'd been altered to point at him because he understood, better than anyone, how deeply Victoria had come to believe her own myth. And he knew exactly what he needed to do the moment they allowed him his one phone call. When the officer finally slid the phone across the table toward him, Daniel didn't call a bail bondsman. He didn't call a public defender. He dialed a number he hadn't used in nearly 2 years, and when Marcus Webb picked up on the second ring, sounding groggy and confused, Daniel said only 6 words. "It's Daniel. It's time. Move now." Marcus didn't ask questions. He'd been waiting 4 years for that exact sentence. By the time the sun set that evening, Marcus Webb had filed emergency documentation with the state corporate registry, formally reactivating Daniel's controlling authority as majority shareholder of Sterling Innovations through the Emily Grace Trust. He had contacted the company's outside legal counsel, the board of directors, and most importantly, the federal auditor who had been quietly investigating irregular fund transfers for the past 6 weeks, and handed over a folder of evidence Daniel had compiled on his own time over the last several months, ever since he'd first noticed the discrepancies. Bank routing numbers, time-stamped internal emails Victoria had assumed were long deleted, a trail leading directly to the shell account tied to her sister's real estate firm. Daniel was released on his own recognizance less than 18 hours later, the charges against him quietly suspended pending a material change in circumstances, which was the driest possible legal language for what was actually an earthquake. He picked Lily up from her after-school program that same afternoon, scooped her into a hug that lasted a little longer than usual, and when she asked if everything was okay, he told her the truth, the way he always tried to with her, even when it was complicated. "Something happened today that was really unfair, sweetheart, but I think it's about to get fixed." 3 days later, Sterling Innovations held an emergency board meeting. Victoria walked into that boardroom expecting to discuss quarterly projections and, if she was being honest, with herself, to quietly celebrate the fact that her inconvenient logistics employee had been dealt with. Instead, she found the room already occupied not just by the usual board members, but by an outside auditor, 2 attorneys. She didn't recognize, and, sitting calmly at the head of the table in a clean but simple gray sweater, Daniel Carter. "You," she said, and for the first time in years, her composed voice actually cracked. "You're supposed to be in jail?" Daniel finished for her, his voice quiet but unshakably steady. "The charges were based on falsified records tied to your login access to the compliance system, not mine. That's been confirmed by 3 independent forensic reviewers over the last 72 hours. Marcus Webb slid a folder across the table. Inside was everything the trust documents proving Daniel's 51% ownership, the falsified security footage timestamps that didn't match the actual server logs, the wire transfers to the shell account, and sworn statements from 2 junior compliance officers who had noticed irregularities months earlier and been quietly told to let it go by Victoria herself. Victoria's face went through several colors in the span of about 10 seconds. She reached for anger first, insisting this was some kind of hostile takeover, some fabricated conspiracy. But the numbers didn't care about her anger. The board, faced with irrefutable evidence and the very real threat of federal fraud charges landing on the company itself if they didn't act, voted unanimously with Daniel now exercising his full ownership authority for the first time in 4 years to remove Victoria Sterling from her position effective immediately, pending the outcome of a criminal investigation into the misappropriated funds. She was escorted from the building that same afternoon by the very same security team that, 4 days earlier, had watched her smile while Daniel was walked out in handcuffs. This time, there were no cuffs. Not yet but there was a formal referral to the district attorney's office, and within 2 weeks, an indictment on multiple counts of wire fraud and falsification of corporate records. The woman who had built her entire public identity on a story that was never truly hers watched that identity collapse in the span of 9 days. Daniel didn't take a victory lap. He didn't hold a press conference or gloat the way Victoria had. Instead, he did what he'd always done, best he quietly rebuilt. He brought back 2 engineers Victoria had pushed out for questioning her decisions. He personally apologized to every employee on the 4th floor who had watched him get arrested, thanking them for their discomfort and their silence, understanding that most people don't know what to do when they see something wrong happening to someone they barely know. He restructured the compliance department so that no single executive could ever again quietly bury an internal warning. And when reporters eventually caught wind of the story, a secret billionaire founder framed by CEO reclaims company after public arrest Daniel gave exactly 1 interview, and in it, he talked less about the money and more about his daughter. People are going to remember the handcuffs, he told the reporter, sitting in a plain conference room, still wearing a simple button-up shirt because some things about him hadn't changed and never would. But what I want people to remember is that being underestimated isn't the same as being powerless. I spent 4 years choosing to be Lily's father before I was anyone's CEO. That was never a weakness. That's the reason I still had something worth protecting when everything else got taken from me. Lily, now old enough to understand a little more of what had happened, asked her father one evening while they were making dinner together why he never told anyone the truth sooner, why he let people think he was just a logistics worker for so long. Daniel thought about it for a long moment, stirring the pot on the stove, before he answered her honestly. Because for a while, sweetheart, being your dad was the only title I ever wanted people to know me by. Everything else could wait. And it turns out waiting didn't make me weaker. It just meant that when the truth mattered most, I still had it to give. Sterling Innovations was quietly renamed within the year, not back to some grand founder's name, but to something simpler, Carter and Grace Technologies, a nod to both his late wife and the daughter who had kept him anchored through it all. Victoria Sterling's trial concluded 8 months later with a conviction on 4 counts of fraud, and the empire she had spent years building on borrowed credit and a stolen story finally, completely, came apart exactly the way it had been built quietly, and then all at once. Daniel never forgot the sound of those handcuffs clicking shut or the sight of Victoria laughing behind that glass. But he also never let that moment define him the way she had hoped it would. Instead, he let it remind him of something far more important, that real power was never about being seen or believed or even respected by people who barely knew him. Real power had been sitting quietly at his kitchen table every single night for 4 years, doing homework in crayon, asking for extra pancakes, and calling him Dad. Everything else the company, the money, the empire he'd once built and then walked calmly back into had simply been waiting for him to decide it was time. And if there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The people who are underestimated are often underestimated for a reason, not because they lack power, but because they've simply chosen, for now, to spend that power on something the world can't always see. Never let anyone convince you that quiet means weak, or that patience means surrender. Sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones everyone else forgot to notice. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories like this one, because there are so many more journeys of quiet strength, hidden truth, and the kind of love that outlasts every storm still waiting to be told.